Did Jesus have an invisible spaceship to fly up to heaven in? I'm actually somewhat serious about this question. I know that most Christians say that Jesus rose bodily from the dead and ascended bodily into heaven, like Father Casey in today's video. What I don't think that many Christians have thought about, though, is how could this be possible? Rather, I think that most just think that if God can make Jesus ascend into heaven, well, God would also be able to make sure that Jesus stayed alive for the journey. Maybe he was encased in some kind of life-sustaining bubble, an invisible spaceship. Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Today, Mama Atheist, aka Pale Blue Mama, joins me to talk about an astrophysicist's view of the claims about Jesus' ascension. This is an idea that I've been kicking around since Easter, and I finally find a way to frame it when I saw this video from Father Casey on Jesus' body. You likely recall Father Casey, as several atheists have responded to his condescending video calling on atheists to be good atheists. Here he says, well, I'll let him speak for himself.
As humans, we sure do care about our bodies, don't we? At least the way they look. As swimsuit season is just around the corner, many of us are starting to take our diets more seriously. Going to the gym, checking ourselves out in the mirror more and more, the whole works.
Right off the bat, I'm wondering why someone who dresses like him and has taken a vow of celibacy is noticing how people look in swimsuits. Two ways he could be going with this. He could be just appealing to what he thinks is on many minds, especially after a year of COVID. Many of us have put on a few pounds. Or maybe he's going for a sermon on gluttony. That's actually one of my favorite sins to talk about. When I hear, I just call sin, sin, when Christians are going on about the evils of the LGBTQ agenda, I ask if they call out gluttony when they see it. Do they protest at restaurants for serving too large a portion size? If he is, well, at least he's consistent in his views. I'll give him that. Let's see where he goes with this one.
It's because of this that's got me thinking lately. You know who had a good body? Jesus. Jesus had a great body. I mean, have you ever seen a chubby Jesus on the cross? I don't think so. He is always well-toned, low body fat, clearly a man.
He does realize that not only are these not pictures of Jesus, but it's also very unlikely that Jesus looked like this.
And who has worked what? Okay, I think we've taken this one a little too far. I am, of course, kidding, at least in part.
Okay, it was a joke. That last Jesus was interesting. It gets me to wondering why this is the image that Westerners have of Jesus. I mean, most of the images were all pretty similar, and yet they are all also most likely inaccurate, as Jesus would not have been white.
As familiar and sometimes creative as the artistic depictions of Jesus have become, the fact of the matter is that we just don't know what Jesus' body looked like. He could have been skinny and toned, or maybe it could have been a bit chubby, who knows? We don't. We can speculate, but there's nothing definitive to go on.
It's interesting that the picture that is more likely to be accurate, based on where Jesus was from, this one, he dismisses so quickly.
What we do know, and why I'm most certainly not kidding at all when I say that Jesus had a great body, is the fact that he had one at all. That God took on flesh in the incarnation, kind of the most amazing mystery imaginable, but also that he kept that body after his death and resurrection.
So he finds it most remarkable that Jesus even had a body. Is it remarkable that we have bodies? I'm not sure why he finds this so remarkable. Whether Jesus kept his body after the alleged resurrection is actually a question that I have for Christians. The descriptions in the Bible are sometimes consistent with a physical body, but not always. Let's see where he goes.
Notice how he's depicted in the post-resurrection narratives. Think about how he interacted with the disciples. In Luke's gospel, the two disciples only realize that it's him when he physically breaks the bread in front of them.
First, this is one of the passages that points to it not being Jesus' physical body. After all, the disciples were intimate friends, traveling everywhere with him. They were closer to him than anyone else at the end of his life, and yet even they cannot recognize him. Why? When they see him do something that they've seen him do before, breaking bread, then they recognize him. They recognize him from the act, but not from the physical form before them. This would point to a post-resurrection Jesus having a body different from what he had before. This not only doesn't support his point, it completely contradicts it. Yet this is where you start. Normally you lead with your best argument. If this is your best, and your best doesn't support your point, maybe you don't have much of an argument. Not only that, he left out two parts of the story, two parts that go even further to disprove his point. The disciples met with Jesus on the road to Emmaus. We don't know how long they walked together, but it was long enough for Jesus to preach to them about how the Messiah would be resurrected, and then to explain, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, explaining all the scriptures about himself. If the entire Old Testament points to Jesus, as Christians claim, this would have taken quite some time. And the passage supports this taking quite some time, because at the end of the sermon, they say it's late, come spend the night with us. And he does. So they spend the whole afternoon with him, listening to him preach something that should have been very familiar to them and something that they would have recognized as something that they've been doing together for the last 3 years. But they don't recognize him. Instead, they don't see him until he breaks the bread. Why? We have no explanation from the Bible except that the disciples were prevented from recognizing him. Why? Is Jesus hiding? If so, for what purpose? Is the resurrection supposed to be a secret? Once they recognize Jesus, he immediately disappears. If your point is to show that Jesus had a physical body, then don't point to a story where as soon as people realize it's him, he disappears. Human bodies don't just disappear. If the strongest evidence of a resurrection is all the eyewitnesses to it, and God wants people to believe that it was real, why would he go to such lengths to keep it a secret all afternoon, even from his own followers? Finally, who are these people that he's calling disciples in this story? They likely were disciples of Jesus, but they were not the traditional 12 that we call the disciples. The passage only identifies them saying, "Now that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus." Going back to see who the "they" is, we see the women who had seen the empty tomb telling the 11, remember Judas had died, and the others. Since in verse 18 it clearly identifies one of them as being named Cleopas, they could not have been the 11. It's not really important that they be the 12, it could be other disciples, but as he goes on, he never makes this distinction, leaving one with the impression that all of these appearances are to the 12, even though he doesn't directly say that. The only reason I even bring this up is that in watching this video, I was under the impression that he was talking about the 11, both here and in the passages he goes on to afterward. And I think this is how many misconceptions about the Bible creep into modern thinking. We lump together different events involving different people and then think of them as involving the same people when they don't.
He tells those in the upper room to touch his wounds.
Again, this doesn't point to a physical resurrection of his original body. I know Christians think it does. Look, he even has the wounds from the cross. Except, what real physical body has wounds like this? If this was a real physical human body, an open wound like this would be bleeding profusely. Thomas sticking his finger into it would cause serious pain. Again, this is evidence that if there really was a resurrection, The resurrected Jesus doesn't occupy the same physical body as before. This isn't even a human body if it can do this.
And he eats fish in front of them.
I'll grant him this one. This is one of the points that does point to a human body. So why is this his third point when the first two disprove his point?
In John's Gospel, Jesus breathes on them. Thomas puts his finger in Jesus' side, and Jesus hands them bread and fish to eat.
The breathing, yes, point to human. But again, Thomas putting his hand in Jesus' side, no. No human could do this. Handing the disciples some bread is neutral. But again, he's left out the portion of the passage that is most damaging to his case. Verse 19 says they were all locked in a room and Jesus was suddenly there with them. Physical human bodies don't walk through walls. This is the same passage where Thomas was invited to touch Jesus' wounds. It's not that he was selectively choosing which appearances to discuss. He's selective in which portion of the story of the appearance he wants you to hear about. So from John, we get 1 plus, 2 minuses, and 1 neutral. Again, not very good evidence of a resurrected physical body.
Jesus clearly had a body. He is physical in nature, just like them, able to speak, breathe, touch, and even eat.
But also with open wounds that don't bleed and can not only be touched, but they can put their hands into the wounds without Jesus feeling pain. Completely unrecognizable even to his closest friends, and one that disappears when you realize who it is. Another appearance he left out was the one that's recorded in John in verses 11 through 17, where he appears to Mary Magdalene, another one of his closest companions. She also doesn't recognize him, even when he is talking to her. Here, he says that she can't touch him because he hasn't ascended yet. It sounds like he has to ascend to heaven and then he'll be back for the appearances where he'll be in his body and then they can touch him. If that's the case, then Jesus' body should still be in the tomb, and this is just the spirit that will ascend and come back for the body. But that can't be. They just looked into the tomb and the body wasn't there. Peter and John both said that Jesus wasn't in the tomb. If this is the physical risen Jesus, did he ascend twice? Or is he referring to the ascension that will come about 40 days from now? If so, why can't Mary touch the resurrected Jesus when a few verses later the disciples are invited to touch him? What is most amazing to me in this is I had never even noticed this inconsistency before I wrote this script. I had to go and consult some commentaries on this. As a believer, my understanding of this passage and what was preached to me was that Mary saw Jesus before the bodily resurrection, and Jesus needed to go check in with the Father, and then he would be back for the bodily resurrection. The fact that John and Peter have already seen the empty tomb had never occurred to me. In consulting several commentaries, the one linked in the description had the best explanation. It had the one that I had always been taught, but it dismissed that one as inaccurate for this very reason. The body is already gone. It concludes that the ascension that Jesus speaks about here is the one to come in 40 days, and the reason Jesus tells Mary not to touch him is that he has something else for her to do now, to go and tell the 11 that he has risen and that he will come and see them. The reason Jesus gives her for not touching him or to hold him, depending on which translation you are reading, is because Jesus has stuff to do here on earth for a few days, but when Mary gets to heaven, then she will be able to hold on to him as much as she wants to. The author of the commentary has done a good job of making John 20 internally coherent. But when the stories are taken together, they don't support Father Casey's point for a bodily resurrection. The only way to make the story consistent is to select portions of it and omit the portions that don't support your point, just as Father Casey is doing here. Father Casey could just as easily have selected portions that show Jesus not to have a physical body and then make the opposite case. Why is this so? If this is supposed to be the greatest news in the history of the planet, why are there only 2 of the 4 Gospels that even have post-detailed resurrection stories? And why are the stories so inconsistent? The post resurrection appearances in Mark are only in the portion that even most Christian scholars agree were added later and were not part of the original gospel. It ends with an angel telling the women that Jesus has risen, but no one actually sees him. In Matthew, the women see Jesus at the tomb, and he tells them that he will see the disciples in Galilee. And then Jesus is with the disciples in Galilee at his ascension. There are no other appearances. The most logical conclusion is the stories are inconsistent even within the written accounts within Luke and John, because they were written by someone who collected them from several different sources, and the writer was trying to put these conflicting stories into one narrative. Or the Gospels were written by multiple authors, and the person who compiled the writings tried to make them fit together into one story, even though they don't always quite fit together very well.
This is not some disembodied spirit, a hologram, or as Luke points out, a ghost.
The disciples had a good reason to think that Jesus was a ghost and not a real person. Just a few verses later, the two returned to Jerusalem, and it says, "They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11, and those with them assembled together and saying, 'It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon.' Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said, 'Peace be with you.' They were startled and frightened, thinking that they saw a ghost." If I was talking about someone and suddenly they just appear out of nowhere, especially when I think that person is dead, seeing a ghost is a very reasonable explanation. So the post-resurrection appearances in Luke and John are about 50-50 for whether they are more ghost-like or human-like. What about the other two Gospels? In Mark, there wasn't even a resurrection. We had the women finding an empty tomb and the angel telling them that Jesus is risen, and they go and tell no one. That's it. Even the disciples never hear about Jesus supposedly rising. And remember Matthew's Gospel, the women who came to the tomb are told by the angel that Jesus has risen. They go. Jesus tells them to tell the disciples that he will see them in Galilee. Next, we have a story about how the guards were bribed to say the disciples stole the body, and then we're in Galilee and Jesus is saying goodbye to the disciples. There isn't a description of Jesus or his body, but it does say that they worshipped him, but some doubted. As a believer, I always took this to mean Thomas, but it doesn't say Thomas. It says some. It sounds like not all of the disciples are believers. It certainly doesn't paint a picture of all of them thinking that this is a resurrected Jesus. So I can see why Father Casey didn't want to include this one either.
Even after the resurrection, Jesus maintained his physical form and human nature. They remained a part of who he was, which is incredibly important when you remember that nothing changed at the ascension. At no point in any of the Gospels does it ever say that he discarded his body. When he ascended into heaven, it doesn't say, "and then his spirit rose to heaven, leaving his body on earth."
For this part, I need a little help from Amanda, aka Pale Blue Mama. Welcome, Amanda. Thank you for coming and joining me and helping me with this, as there are some portions to this video that call for a little bit of expertise that you have.
No problem. I'm always glad to help you out. God is great.
Jesus maintained his physical form and human nature. They remained a part of who he was, which is incredibly important when you remember that nothing changed at the ascension. At no point in any of the Gospels does it ever say that he discarded his body. When he ascended into heaven, it doesn't say, "and then his spirit rose to heaven, leaving his body on earth." No. It simply says he parted from them and was taken up to heaven.
Okay, and this is what I wanted to discuss with you, is this idea that Jesus' physical body rose into heaven. And I'm wondering what would happen to a human body that just arose up into space.
For the sake of the experiment itself, let's say he's still alive as he's ascending into heaven right now. So you yourself, Kelly, you have this scenario in front of you. You're in space, or you're in some kind of spaceship station, whatever, and you see that you're about to be ejected into space itself with no protection. You've got no suit whatsoever. What is your first instinct? What do you think you're going to do?
Probably taking a deep breath, because in anticipation of not having any oxygen available.
Okay, and there it is. That would be the end of you, because first of all, you have the vacuum of space. Okay, so you will have the strength of your lungs fighting the absolute vacuum that is space itself. So you go and you fill your lungs with air, and you go out into space, and immediately that air is going to rapidly expand. Okay. The oxygen molecules will actually get forcibly ripped from your body because of the difference between, the vacuum of space and your body itself. So the very absolute last thing that you would want to do is breathe in air. That would be a terrible thing to do. So the air molecules in your lungs expanding and everything would be your first issue. You would want to expel all of the air that you can from your lungs as possible. And then the next issue that your body would need to contend with would be complete vaporization of all the water in your body. It's atmospheric pressure. That's what it is. When you're on Earth or you're on any kind of planet, you're subject to atmospheric pressure, which allows for water molecules in your body to kind of act appropriately. So in this case, they kind of stay that way. When you are let out into space and there is none at all, no atmospheric pressure whatsoever, these water molecules inside of your body will immediately vaporize. Not going to be a really good situation for you. Obviously, everything's going to pretty much kill you. The water molecules in your body, when you're on Earth and you have this atmospheric pressure, they remain in equilibrium with the air itself on the outside of your body. But like I said, once again, when you're out in space, the atmospheric pressure is gone. So you have no equilibrium between the air itself and the water molecules inside of your body. So they will end up vaporizing immediately. And this what will happen because of the vaporization of the water molecules is that you'll actually swell up really big, and probably to about twice your normal size. This vaporization of the water molecules will do. Because your body can actually take it, because your skin is like super duper stretchy. So you'd be able to, maintain that. But obviously, you're not really going to live through it. So you would just up really big to about twice your size. And then you would be conscious through all of this, because the human circulatory system is incredibly strong. So we would be able to keep our consciousness while blow up from these expanded water molecules in our body. But it would only be about 15 seconds, because we would be completely depleted of oxygen, and within that 15 seconds we would pass out, and then within 2 minutes, not having oxygen, we would be dead. So the next step would be any of the moisture on your body. So like the moisture in your tongue, your saliva, the stuff in your nose, your eyes, this would immediatlike And again, this is due to the change in atmospheric pressure, the complete lack of it. And this would not be this would not be like a hot boil. It would be a violent, aggressive form of evaporation that would just happen really quickly. So it's a boil, but it's not like, boil water on the stove kind of boil.
More like the jets from a hot tub.
Yeah, kind of. Almost, it's a change in state, essentially. Another thing you have to contend with in space too is ultraviolet radiation. When you're on a planet, you have an atmosphere that's able to protect you from direct radiation from any star you're near. So if you're out in space and completely exposed, if you're facing any star whatsoever, you will be immediately, completely and totally sunburned from that. And not only the radiation from the stars itself, but there's also cosmic radiation that constantly travels through space that you would be bombarded with as well. So you get burnt to a basic crisp, unless you're like hiding behind an asteroid or something like that. And then let's not forget the temperature of what space is. How cold do you think space is, Goddess Granny?
Well, I know that when I ride in an airplane and I look at the information on the screen, it shows that it's like 200 degrees below zero, just at the level where the airplane is. So I'm going to guess maybe 400 below zero.
Was that Celsius or Fahrenheit?
That would be Fahrenheit.
It's actually about 450 below zero Fahrenheit. It's 2.7 Kelvin, which is minus 270 degrees Celsius. Obviously, there's going to be differences in temperature, but for the most part, the basic temperature is, well, extraordinarily cold. And you have, again, no atmosphere, no water, nothing there that's going to be able to hold in the water or hold in the heat like you would be able to on Earth with air around you that keeps you warm. One really cool thing, though, about all of the radiation and the cold that you go through, your body, the bacteria in your body would completely die. So you wouldn't decompose like you would on Earth because there's no bacteria there to decompose you. So you could essentially be a floating corpse for millions of years. And if you're close enough to a star, you can actually mummify. Your body can mummify while you're in space. And
so if it was true that Jesus had a physical body and that physical body ascended into space, it probably is floating out in space somewhere.
Very well possible. There is a dried up husk of a mummy Jesus somewhere that's very, very sunburnt and looks all crazy like he's floating zombie Jesus mummy corpse somewhere up in space. So there you go.
I will look forward to the Hubble telescope finding us this mummy floating through space.
It should be the main goal of the Hubble from now on. Find zombie mummy Jesus. You gotta do it.
One other thing I'm wondering, though, is how much energy would it take to get him through the atmosphere?
Quite a bit. Yeah, obviously, you're fighting against G-forces. You're fighting against the atmosphere itself. But, as opposed to like a spaceship, a rocket or something like that, it's only his own mass. So still quite a bit. Plus, like, the amount of damage that would probably be done to his body alone, just leaving the atmosphere. I mean, he'd be burned up and windblown and everything like that, so it would be destroyed anyway. But if we negated all of that and just got him to space, yeah, all of that shit would happen. He's screwed.
Okay, thank you very much for these comments. This was very helpful. I appreciate that.
Which you probably say, so what? What is he getting at? This is a weird video. I don't know why I clicked on this priest saying that Jesus had a good body. To which I say, yes, you're right, this is a weird video. But it's also one of the most important theological points I've ever made on this channel, so stick with me for a second. What is truly remarkable about this point is that because Jesus retained his body after the resurrection and through the ascension, a part of creation now exists for eternity within the heart of the Trinity. Within God, the all-powerful, all-knowing, immaterial, infinite, and eternal being, there now lives something that is weak, fallible, material, and altogether finite.
I realize that he is trying to draw awe at the incongruity, but it is the incongruity that also makes it an impossibility. I'm sure that he would say it is a mystery. That is the Catholic answer to everything that has no answer. It's a mystery. But if the material lives in the immaterial, if the mortal lives within the immortal, one of three things must happen. Either the immaterial and immortal must become material and mortal, or the mortal and material must become immortal and immaterial, or the laws of physics must be suspended for all of these to exist simultaneously. I would go with the latter of the three, that God as an infinite being could suspend the laws of physics for the area where he exists in order to make that happen, except that God is not supposed to exist in a finite space. He's supposed to be everywhere all at once, including here on Earth. If the laws of physics are suspended everywhere that he is, so that both the material and the immaterial, both the mortal and the immortal, can coexist within him, then the laws of physics must have ceased to exist on Earth at the Ascension. Yet that did not happen. One of the easiest falsifiable claims I have ever encountered.
A part of creation, a part of us, now lives in eternity. I don't know if this hits you quite like it hits me, but the fact that Jesus had a body after the resurrection might just be the most amazing, awe-inspiring, life-changing bit of information that we will ever hear.
Or it could be the biggest whopper we've ever heard, as it simply cannot be true. It makes a nice story. It feels good. But it has no basis in reality.
Think about it. If we accept the mystery of the incarnation as true, that God became a human being, then we must necessarily accept that God is capable of becoming physical at all.
I don't think there is any question that gods can be physical. People have worshipped many people as gods. Things too. People have bowed to statues, rock formations, trees, any number of physical objects have become objects of worship. But it isn't that a god becomes a thing or person, but rather the thing or person becomes a god. It becomes a god when people decide it is a god, just as Jesus was not thought a god during his lifetime. The idea of his deity came after his death. He became a god when people decided that he was a god. He wasn't a god that became a person. He was a person that became a god.
That creation, in general, can be a vessel for God's presence. A belief in the incarnation doesn't just accept that Jesus Christ lived 2,000 years ago, it accepts a sacramental worldview, a vision of the world in which God is capable, and so chooses, to dwell among us. God didn't just create from afar and watch, he continued to mediate his presence in an imminent way.
And this is why the God of the Bible fails as an all-powerful, all-loving God. If God really was capable of mediating his presence in an imminent way and loved humans, would he be letting humans die in their sins in the way he does without, in some imminent way, saying or doing something to make his presence known to all and not just to a select few?
Thus, the sacraments. Thus, bread and wine can become the body and blood of Christ. Water can cleanse and bind. Oil can anoint and transform. These are not just spiritual or mental interactions. These are physical encounters made possible by ordinary objects.
Ordinary objects can become God, and you can touch and taste God, according to Father Casey. This isn't unique to Father Casey. The Catholic Church has said this for centuries. It's also why the Church venerates relics, items that are thought to have been a part of a saint, like a toe, or have belonged to a saint, like a staff. These relics are supposed to have magical powers. But if a person with cancer can take communion, drinking in the very immortal God of the universe, and yet experiences no healing, no change, how can you say there is any immortal God in the wafer or the cup? The Catholic Church believes in transubstantiation. The communion wafer and the wine become the physical body and blood of Jesus. They believe this is a real physical transformation. Some Catholic people will even say that the wafer tastes like flesh. Yuck. No, it doesn't. I have had a Catholic communion, and no, it most definitely did not have the taste or texture of human flesh. How do I know? Have I tasted human flesh? Yes. I have a terrible nervous habit of biting my cheeks. I've been doing it since I was 6. So yes, I have tasted human flesh, and the Eucharist doesn't taste anything like flesh. Scientists have tested consecrated wafers and wine, and the chemical structure is still wafers and wine. I had a discussion with a Catholic person who once said that the chemical properties remain the same, but the Eucharist becomes Jesus in essence. What does that mean? How can you say the transformation is real and physical if it's only in essence and it's not chemically testable? How can a thing be other than what its chemical makeup says that it is? In other words, the only change that the bread, wine, oil, and water undergo when they are consecrated is a change of the imagination.
Unfortunately, we as a people have a very technocratic approach to the world, running our societies with an aim to possess, master, and transform the outside world for human purposes. If something doesn't benefit humanity, it has no worth. And if it does, then we extract everything possible from it. This is very unsustainable and is just downright horrible theology.
And here we get to where I start to agree with Father Casey. Not everything that isn't for humans is discardable. I don't see it as a matter of theology, but as a matter of humanity. I think to be an empathetic human is to see that we need to coexist with the rest of the world, not just with fellow humans. Not everything is about us.
No longer is the world around us seen as creation, the work of God, a vessel of His presence. It's just stuff. Stuff to be taken, exploited, and thrown away. Next week is the 6th anniversary of the promulgation of Pope Francis's original call to care for our common home, and I want to encourage you to take his exhortation seriously this year. Read the document if you haven't. See what he has to say. Take it to prayer. Examine your own conscience and see how God might be calling you to a more integral relationship with creation.
I mean, I'm glad that he recognizes it, that he sees that it's a problem. A lot of evangelicals, a lot of the fundamentalists, AIG, for example, they have started to accept that climate change is a thing. And they're even going so far as some of them accepting that it's anthropogenic, which means, caused by humans, but they are copping out at that point and saying, well, but this is what God wants. So I always feel kind of tentative as to what a religious order or a religious person's answer is going to be, or how they're going to move forward in this conversation, because I don't want to hear, well, whatever, this is God's plan, because it's just not.
Thank you. That's been very helpful. Appreciate your time.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Have a good day.
You too. Thanks, Granny.
And once again, I agree with Father Casey, but for different reasons. We are here for a finite time on this planet, but there will be future generations. Not just future generations of humans, but of animals and plants, too. To care for our world is something that we must do if life is to go on, if we value life. Where I part with Father Casey is in the theology. If the world really was created by God for humans, then just using and discarding this world would be completely acceptable, especially since Revelation says that the world will be destroyed in the end, and the Christians have been telling us for 2,000 years that the end is near. But because there is no God that's going to step in and make a new earth, and there's no God that's going to step in and restore this earth, the only way that we can continue life on this planet is to study what sustains it, like Pale Blue Momma does, and do our best to help in that process. I have read some of the paper that Father Casey is recommending. It basically says that we need to take care of our world, and I agree. As far as we know, it's the only one we're going to get. So what do you know? I actually agree with the Catholic priest, at least on what we need to do. We need to take care of our planet. But not on why we should live this way. Nor do I think God made Jesus an invisible spaceship so that his physical body could ascend into heaven. Live your life.